Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Mess. So today I got a very interesting and unfortunate video for you guys this evening because we're going to be talking about one YouTuber that back in April was raided by the Italian police and actually is facing fines and potential jail time about emulation handhelds and the ROMs contained within them. It is a very interesting story and a very strange story, so we're going to be going over all of the details, talking about how these things work in different jurisdictions and just how sketchy it can be sometimes when actually talking about these topics on YouTube, because nobody should be facing any sort of jail time based upon just reviewing an emulation handheld. That's exactly what is happening today. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor down below, hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But this is based on a YouTuber, Once Word Nerd, and I will leave a link to their channel in the description below, as well as the particular video where they talk about the raid from the Italian government. But the Italian government actually went into his house, raided him, took about 30 different emulation handhelds as well as apparently his phone, and held onto it for over a month before returning it to him. And apparently in Italy, I think I was aware of this, you don't actually get to find out what the charges are against you until they've actually been charged, which is just an absolutely insane sort of situation where you're not quite sure exactly what legal trouble you're facing. You have to wait for the government to actually tell you about that. But the reality is somebody raided this YouTuber's house and started taking out emulation handhelds as evidence along with their phone, which is absolutely wild, because think to yourself right now, depending on where you are in the world, it doesn't really matter how many different emulation devices that you have potentially sitting around you and how many of them have game ROMs on them. This was stuff like the Pow Kitty, the Anbernic, as well as the Trim UI, 2 of 3 of which I've actually reviewed on the channel because you guys always ask for those emulation handhelds, but then honestly you guys never actually watch the videos and you always surprise me by that, so I'm never sure what to think honestly. But the reality is I'm definitely glad I do not live in Italy, because I've shown you guys these consoles on the channel. This is the RG Cube, and when it was shipped in by the company for review, there was definitely an SD card containing a lot of different games, most of which technically I actually do own because I have an extensive collection, but of course I'm sure there was 1 or 2 on there that even I didn't have in my collection. That is what this is all about. The games contained within the device, not the device in and of itself. So it isn't a situation where they're trying to say in Italy emulation is illegal. They're trying to crack down on some of these games that are actually shipping on these cards, and that is not surprising at all. I'll get into it in a little bit in the video, but Italy is famously stringent on copyright protection as well as a lot of brand protections there, and it's all down to some of the luxury goods they have and trying to protect the export and their companies contained within the country to be able to compete in the open market without having counterfeits knocked off. So it's one of those things. This is kind of just part and parcel of that. But you'll see here that Nintendo and Sony were mentioned, but it's not sure if they have any involvement in it, so we're going to default to the fact that they don't, because it could have just been the Italian police mentioning those companies based upon what was contained within these handhelds. This is the Trim UI, one of the consoles mentioned in the paperwork as well as the news stories, and of course when I received this as well, the brick, it definitely had games both from Sony and Nintendo contained within, and that again is just wild. Sure, this is technically not allowed, but honestly, does it raise to the level of a government raiding your house, starting to pull your emulation handhelds out, and potentially fining you up to 15,000 euros and or 3 years in jail, because that is the penalty phase of something like this if this YouTuber is found to have done what the Italian government is accusing him of. And of course, because there are YouTube videos online, the evidence is there that he at least had the items in his possession that were shipped by a company. So it's one of those things that is absolutely something that no one should have to deal with whatsoever. Maybe it shouldn't be on YouTube in Italy. I can understand the Italian laws are different than US laws, but the idea that someone could actually be facing even a night worth of jail time over something as simple as this is just wild. But it's one of those things. Companies have been going after emulation for the longest time, and companies have been going after sharing ROMs for the longest time. It just depends on where you live as to what the actual ramifications of that are. Unfortunately, it seems like in Italy, at least for this instance, they are trying to basically make an example of this case, and it's not like this YouTuber has 10-20 million different subscribers. Technically, the channel is smaller than mine, has about 10,000 subscribers less, which means that if I lived in Italy and did these exact same videos, I too could face something like arrest. Of course, I don't. I live in the US, but it's one of those things. It is still absolutely insane. Something like this could happen. But let's take a look at the channel in and of itself. This is the Once Were Nerd channel, and I will leave a link to this particular video down below. Normally, I don't actually show other people's content, but it is important because I want to support this person, and I want you to be aware of what's going on with them, and they also show the paperwork off from the Italian government. So again, credit on the screen, a link to the particular video down below, and I can't recommend you watch it enough. It is quite interesting just to understand what's going on. But again, I can't stress enough, even if technically this wouldn't be allowed in any country, the idea that reviewing an emulation handheld with games contained within it could result in any sort of jail time just is absolutely insane. Think of all the crimes out there that basically go unpunished in their entirety, and this is the type of stuff that the government's going after. It just reeks of absolute ridiculousness. And they talk about Article 171 of the Italian Constitution and the fines that can actually be applied as far as what's going on here. But basically, the TLDR is piracy is clearly a crime in Italy, as it is basically everywhere else. But the reality of the situation is Italy goes hard on these sort of things when and if they want to. They are notorious for going after counterfeits and everything else like that, so it is a situation where it isn't really that surprising. The public display of these emulation devices with the files on them is a crime. So it's not the fact that you actually own it, it's the fact that you displayed it that can be the issue in and of itself. And I'm not sure who the biggest YouTuber in Italy is, but maybe this channel is one of the relative larger ones, and maybe that's why Italy is definitely making an example out of them. But think of every single channel you've ever seen review an emulation handheld out there, or even an emulation box. It's basically kind of a wink and a nod situation where we basically say, sure, the card came in with some games on it, that's kind of how it works, let's move on from that. But imagine a reality in which, at least in certain countries, even showing these things on camera would be considered a crime. That is just going absolutely too far in my opinion. I don't care what jurisdiction it is in. I'm sure Italy has a lot larger problems out there than trying to put a YouTuber in jail or fine him a metric crap ton of money just to make a point of something like this. It is one of those situations where it seems like basically governments as well as companies still want to make a full court press on this sort of stuff. There was also apparently last year an entire crackdown of $55 million worth of retro gaming consoles in a trafficking ring. Now, I'm sure it probably wasn't worth actually $55 million. It was probably a situation where they assigned a price to every single game on the card and then came up with that total, and then they basically said that they were blaming it on non-certified batteries and electrical circuits. Now, I totally understand you would not want anything imported into your country that didn't meet a safety standard, could potentially set a user's house on fire, but this also sounds a little bit like covering fire for them actually doing this raid and not saying what the real reason was. Now, I can't be sure about that, we're just presuming here, but it is an interesting footnote as far as this actual story is concerned. But Italy is definitely looking, and this happens in the US as well. Back in 2019, there was a crackdown in North Carolina of fake NES mini consoles, and it really does seem like these things just sporadically happen, like they're trying to make an example out of something and then they kind of move on. But think about it right now, if you go to Amazon in your country, you can probably buy 100 different emulation handhelds or consoles that are going to all be populated with these exact same files that a YouTuber in Italy is now facing jail time for. So it's one of those things, how does Amazon get away with selling these things all day long, but an individual halfway across the world could get some jail time for it? It really is one of those things that's just kind of uneven across the board. But when I talk about Italy going hard on this stuff, counterfeiting and protected rights, think of all the Italian brands out there that are famous. They need to be protected, and I understand that because counterfeits are rampant. When I worked at Burton, we had all of our sunglasses produced at a factory in Italy, and a lot of what we dealt with was just basically how you could do business in Italy and the protections they offered for counterfeits, making sure that your product was not knocked off. There's a big difference between a Gucci bag or a pair of sunglasses versus a handheld that gets imported in that might have some files on it. And even though it's only tangentially related, this has happened before on YouTube, but from companies like Nintendo going after the YouTubers for showing emulation. Retro Game Core got hit with not one but two different DMCA takedown requests, basically channel strikes, and I actually talked to them in the background with Mr. Sujano, another YouTube channel, can't recommend it enough, and they basically asked my opinion on what I thought was going on here, just because I do have that legal background dealing for many years in copyright, IP law, and everything else that goes along with it. But this is just absolutely a scary event, and a very weird one at that. just because this YouTuber reviewed handhelds that happened to have files on them, and their house was raided by the Italian government and things were taken as evidence. Now, I totally get that governments can raid you, and in a lot of instances, those raids are probably for good reasons, but this one absolutely is not. No one's really being harmed by these devices because 99.99% of the games on them are not for sale any longer, so there really isn't a quote-unquote victim here. There isn't a company that is losing out on any money, but pretty much every game developer out there would like you to think that if you actually download a game that you don't own, you're taking money out of their pockets, and that trend is just getting bigger and bigger. Now, do I expect to see more of this happening? Probably not. I do think this is an isolated incident, but as far as emulation is concerned, as far as all the lawsuits and court cases we talk about on the channel, this one is just straight up the weirdest and sketchiest one out there. Nobody should ever face jail time for reviewing a handheld. But I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.